That should give us courage.
Exposure to other people's perspectives.
It's moving us in a good direction.
Hey, Carolyn, what's wrong with our approach to mental health in the U.S.?
We have deprioritized care and services for the seriously mentally ill, and now we call everything a mental health problem.
Oh, that's interesting. So if we had more services, would we have fewer mentally ill people?
No, and that is part of the problem. We have been dousing everyone with ineffective, universal mental health and wellness programs when really we should be targeting resources towards the seriously mentally ill. If I can sort of frame that so that we have a better sense of
Sure.
what we're talking about, 100% of people have emotions and hardships that are not, comfortable or pleasant, but are a normal reality of human life. You or I get stressed, anxious, etc. About 20% of people have something that's diagnosed in the DSM, the psychiatry's Bible, essentially. But about 4 to 6% of people have a serious and persistent mental illness, like schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, other psychotic disorders. This is the population that any public mental health system should be focused on. But for the last half century, we've essentially deprioritized that population. And we've now sort of shifted more efforts towards a public health model that tries to prevent mental illness in the few through awareness and early intervention, by sending this sort of public health model of promoting mental health towards everyone.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack here. So
Sure.
if someone were schizophrenic in, say, a tribal culture, I've read accounts that those people were viewed as shaman, or they would be viewed as prophets. So to what extent, and there's a body of literature on this, I'm not that familiar with it, but that mental health itself is a cultural phenomenon. Like yeah.
Yeah, sure. So I think definitely it depends probably on what we're defining as a mental health problem. Before the 1800s, and I don't know a lot about other cultures, just primarily what we've done in the US, but before the 1800s, we didn't call things mental illnesses. We called psychotic people distracted persons or lunatics. We sort of have developed now over time this classification system.
I'm sorry, I'm laughing. We just have plenty of lunatics running around today. Go ahead.
Well, yes, we call everyone lunatics, right? But we also call everything like stress and anxiety a mental health disorder. And so I think that there's a question about sort of like how much we're sort of categorizing as something that's appropriate for mental health intervention. And we're calling more and more things mental health problems. And I think that's problematic because we're basically medicalizing social problems. This sort of public health model that again sort of douses everyone with these awareness efforts and early intervention efforts. All this model is doing is pushing more and more people towards treatment. Well, if mental health treatment could prevent mental illness, we wouldn't have mental illness anymore. The fact of the matter is we don't know what causes mental illness. It's what some of these things are that you're talking about. Anxiety, depression. There is some evidence of social contagion here, and there is some evidence that mental disorders are a function of our, culture, our society. But things like schizophrenia, we have had problems with psychotic individuals for essentially all of history. Prevalence rates for these type of psychotic disorders have pretty much stayed flat. For other disorders, they've really sort of expanded. And I think we should be asking more questions about why that's happening, and whether or not mental health treatment is the right treatment, quote unquote, for any given problem. I don't think it is the right treatment for any given problem. Again, I think mental health treatment is much better when targeted towards individuals who need that type of intervention. But today we just sort of tend to throw mental health treatment as like a solution for everything.
So what percentage of homeless people have mental health issues?
It's estimated to be about 20%. And this is
Wow,
highly
I'm
disproportionate
shocked
in terms
by
of,
that.
yeah, that's much high. Do you think that's a lot low or high?
I think that's just extraordinarily low. And I guess, covariant with that would be addiction. We haven't talked about that, and then the comorbidities. But so only 20%. Wow, I'm
We can talk
really.
about how
And
you
how do
get
they get
those.
that? Yeah,
Yeah, sure.
yeah,
So
yeah. How do you get that
point in
data?
time surveys. So what happens is once a year, cities go out and they essentially count the homeless individuals that are on every street corner, and then they submit those counts to HUD, to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Federal Department of Housing and Urban Development. And then HUD puts together this estimate of homeless mental illness. So, there's a huge measurement, I think, problem there.
No,
But it's what we have.
I,
That's the
I
statistic.
lost you for a second.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, so I lost you at HUD. Let's take it up from there. They go
Yeah, so
around,
HUD,
cities go, they count homeless people. They go, oh yeah, go ahead.
yeah, so HUD gives cities, for example, funding to do point in time surveys. So once a year, individuals go out. Usually it's in the winter in a very cold. They want to go out in the winter when it's cold because the assumption is if you had a place to be, you would be there. They're really trying to get at the unsheltered homeless population. So in the middle of January or February, in the middle of the night, you're going to get the best sort of estimate of how many people really have nowhere else to go. So these point in time surveys are collected, and then estimates are made based on those surveys, which are all submitted to HUD to figure out how many of those homeless individuals might have mental illness.
Well, that kind of begs the question, how do they figure that out? I mean, I realize that some guy's walking down the street saying he's Jesus, that's an easy check box, but yeah.
Every city does this a little bit differently. In New York City, for the most part, they use volunteers. So volunteers ask these questions and you make a judgment call, essentially. That's one way that we collect these statistics. There's a huge separate problem of federal statistics on serious mental illness that we can talk about as well. The federal statistical system essentially collects no timely statistics on even prevalence rates of serious mental illness. Most federal surveys, they don't include the institutionalized population, people in group homes, nursing homes, people who are incarcerated. That's where you're going to get at a lot of these seriously mentally ill individuals. And so it's really hard to get a good sense of what this measurement is. Regardless of what the measurement is, because we have used these same methods over time, that prevalence rate has essentially remained flat.
Okay, and so maybe this is outside of or adjacent to your area. So, and I'm picking this up from San Francisco and a lot of the work Schellenberger and others have done in this area. What percent of homeless people have substance use disorders?
This is definitely outside of my beat, but there is a lot of co-occurrence between substance use disorders and mental illness.
Okay, so let's just accept by fiat that that's the case, that 20% of homeless people suffer from some kind of mental illness. What should be done to help them that we're not doing?
Yeah, so I'll also add about the same rate of mentally ill individuals are incarcerated. Mentally ill individuals are also disproportionately repeat hospitalized. So they're brought to the ERs, they're sort of in for very short-term holds and then released. All of these things together, I think, paint a picture of a very vulnerable population that is not being served well. They're sort of stuck on what my colleague and I like to call the institutional circuit of homelessness, incarceration, repeat hospitalization, arrests, etc. Now, some of these people before the 1950s would have been institutionalized in a psychiatric hospital, and would love to talk about the history of that. But we are not institutionalizing most of these people anymore for a number of reasons. But one of the reasons is we just don't have these psychiatric hospitals in the same number that we did. We have about 5% of the psychiatric hospital beds that we did in the 1950s.
Interesting. Okay, so I'll throw a question out at you that few people would say, but many people would think. What is the response to, well, screw them. It's not my problem. If they want to defecate on themselves or sleep in doorways, I don't really care. I just don't want to spend the money. It's either their own fault or not. I just don't care about it at all. Like, what is the response to that kind of statement or attitude? Or what should it be?
Well, I think you should care, because we should want to live in a society where we can take the subway and not be afraid of being pushed in front of it by someone who has untreated serious mental illness. I think there's a real public safety concern here, but also it's not humane. I mean, hopefully we would want to treat individuals with a little bit more humanity than, letting them sort of ride this institutional circuit. If someone is defecating on themselves, if someone is outside in the freezing cold without shoes and, their feet are blistering, is that person a danger to themselves or others? Probably. And so we should want to be doing more for those individuals. The other thing I'll say is right now, these individuals, they're really bad off, but we are spending a lot of money on them. It costs a lot of money to, grow our homeless systems. It costs a lot of money to grow our criminal justice system. If we're going to spend money serving these individuals through all these other public systems, wouldn't it be better to just serve them through a mental health system that is focused on those individuals, as opposed to a mental health system that's trying to prevent something we don't know what the causes are for by giving every, public school kid a therapist before they even need a therapist? I'm just not sure that is the right use of resources.
Yeah, that's a great answer.
So what we are doing. There is a lot of effort right now at kids' mental health services.
To get children mental health services.
Preemptively, even 1 in 3 kids last year, according to a federal SAMHSA survey, Substance Abuse Mental Health Services Administration, 1 in 3 kids had mental health services last year. 1 in 5, so fewer, reported a single 2-week period of distress. So more kids than even are reporting distress are getting mental health services. I think that's something we should be more concerned about than maybe we are.
Why is that? Is that there's a culture that kind of pushes them into it, or That's
exactly right. This is our whole public health model. The public health model is sort of based on early intervention and prevention. So everything in a public health model for mental health is sort of working to do the same thing, essentially, and that's push more people into services upstream. If we catch this thing early, we can prevent it from happening. So we have all these awareness campaigns about what mental health is. We try to train teachers how to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental disorders. And then we have all these sort of anti-stigma campaigns, everything that's saying it's okay to seek help. If you feel distressed, go seek help, go seek help early. It's okay. Here are all the signs and symptoms of a mental disorder. So if you're feeling anxious, yep, that might be it. Maybe you should go check that out and make sure it's not it. I mean, everything in this sort of public health model is working towards getting more people into treatment. That wouldn't be that bad of a thing if treatment was super effective, but it's not. It's not curative. It's not preventative. And it can be harmful in the same way that any medical intervention is. And one thing I think we need to recognize is that there's a lot of low quality mental health care out there right now.
Yeah, I had a buddy of mine on the show who's a well-known therapist, and I asked him if there's actually any evidence for the fact that talking about your problems ameliorates some underlying condition. I understand that questioning that is a kind of heresy, but I think it's important. Let me ask you a question. So something I've been thinking about, is this a right-left issue? And I realize that asking that those are no longer very useful anymore, but there's still a there to what the right wants and what the left wants. So are the treatment of people who suffer from mental illness, is that like a partisan issue or polarized issue? Do the Democrats want to spend more or what?
Yeah, here's the interesting thing I think about mental health policy. I think this is one place where there is potential for bipartisan effort. I think the problem is the right just doesn't have any ideas and the left has bad ideas.
Interesting. So this is a related question. Are the right and the left talking to each other about these issues? Excuse me.
They talk.
Is there a conversation between? They do.
Yeah. So think about the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act. After the Uvalde, Texas shooting, there was a big push towards getting more mental health services out there. The problem should not be. The question should not be, has access been expanded enough? The question should be, who are we expanding access for? If we are promoting these programs, these universal mental health programs, awareness programs, mental health awareness training for everyone, we're trying to teach teachers how to recognize this stuff. That is the wrong approach. Teachers know who these kids are. Adults know who these kids are. You have parents with seriously mentally ill adult children who are like, screaming, raising their hands, trying to say, I need help. My kid needs help. We don't have a problem identifying the people who need help. We're just not giving them enough resources. We're instead just sort of like casting the widest net possible and capturing all these false positives, which makes it harder to actually get the right services to the right kids.
Wow,
all these school shooters, almost always they're known. They've been through these systems. People know. It's rarely the case that we had no idea that this kid was going to shoot up our school, or that this individual who has cycled through 40 arrests in New York was going to push someone in front of a subway. It's rarely the case. We know exactly who these people are, and we just need to get them more effective and intensive services.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was looking at the. I've been interested in the Jordan Neely case. Are you familiar with that? About
he had been arrested 42 times. 42 times.
Yeah, and I'm fascinated by what the verdict for that will be. And the reason I asked you if it's partisan is because I wonder if, from what I've seen, people on the center, on the right, want Neely freed, and people on the left basically want him to be in prison for the rest of his life. It's a little stark and dramatic, but that's the essence of that is true. And so I think that that's an example of someone who, as you said, was arrested a lot, but the issue of race clouds that for many people. Are there issues of race with mental health in mental health treatment and prevention?
I think that's right with the Jordan Neely case, that this did become a racial issue. And it's sad because both sides are calling for accountability, and they're calling for accountability in the wrong way. I think we need to hold the mental health system accountable. I don't think that someone like Jordan Neely should have been in a position where he was so known to the system and was just not held long enough in the hospital. He wasn't held long enough to get stabilizing treatment. And some people like Jordan Neely, who have an inability to stay safe and not, I mean, a few other of his arrests had been for violent behaviors. So I think for people like Jordan Neely who can't remain stable and can't, you know, remain unable to harm themselves or others, we need to be thoughtful about making sure that our processes for hospitalizing are not overly strict, so that we, you know, we're preventing, our processes are so strict, we basically do not help people unless they are at the point of danger to themselves or others. It's imminent, or until after tragedy has happened. That's too late. So people like Jordan Neely, we should help them before they get to that point, by making sure that they have access to intensive treatment and services long enough. And that may be a long time for some people.
Yeah. So I'm thinking about, I'm just lingering on something you said. So you said before that the left has bad ideas and the right has no ideas. So two questions. My first question is, so you're a fellow at the Manhattan Institute. Do they have any ideas or any policy prescriptions? And my second question, perhaps you can answer this one first, is what are the bad ideas that the left has? Like, could you,
Yeah,
ideally you'd rank order them. Like, what's the worst bad idea they have?
just this whole idea that we should get every kid access to mental health treatment. Mental health treatment is high quality mental health treatment. It's really important, but it is not going to solve every problem. Youth mental health treatment tends to be much less effective than adult mental health treatment. What people want to do on the left often is just dump resources into schools, just douse kids with as much superficial programming. It really is a lot of universal sort of like wellness programming, awareness campaigns. These are the worst ideas, I think. People are well aware of mental disorders. The DSM is like an Amazon bestseller. Okay, kids know that this framework is out there. They are using it. They are self-diagnosing. We do not need more awareness programming, and we don't need it in schools. I think that really confuses roles and responsibilities between systems. The education system is facing its own challenges. I'm sure you are well aware of these. You know, if people knew how many kids could read at a third grade reading level right now, in reality, I think they would be plenty concerned with all the things that the public school system has to focus on that's not mental health programming. Because mental health programming for youth is so ineffective, I think that's a low quality trade for things like literacy programs and other sort of educational interventions that schools should focus on. So I think school-based mental health programs are one of the worst solutions that I think are being pushed by the left. Now, as for the right, Manhattan Institute, I, as a researcher there, have a very specific policy subscription, and that is we should repeal a longstanding and outdated Medicaid provision called the Institutes for Mental Diseases Exclusion that has created a massive financial disincentive for states to maintain adequate bed capacity, psychiatric bed capacity.
Fascinating. I love those specific prescriptions. Okay, so I'm going to ask you a few more questions about that in a moment, but there's so much to talk about in the conversation. Let's go back, let's just rewind the conversation just a little bit. When you say mental health treatment, what are you talking about? Are you talking like just going to a therapist and receiving some kind of behavioral or cognitive intervention? Are you talking about antipsychotics? What are you talking about?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. So mental health treatment usually is three things: psychotherapies, medications, and then more sort of structural interventions, like someone's built environment where they are receiving treatment. All three of those things could constitute mental health treatment. Therapy, I think, is a particularly problematic area, not because I have anything against psychotherapy. I think good psychotherapy, if you are someone that wants to better understand yourself, better understand, why you act the way you do, maybe how you can change your behavior to, live a life that you want to, that is closer to how you want to live your life. Great. Psychotherapy can help with that. But the problem is, so many people are just calling themselves therapists now. And what does that even mean? What's out there? What's their training? What is sort of like the models that they have been trained to consider when we're giving kids these, or giving anyone these interventions? I think there's just a lot of bad quality therapy out there, and that concerns me. People like Jonathan Shedler, Camila Ortiz, they're doing a very useful thing, I think, by helping to clarify what good psychotherapy is and should be. It is not something that should be used to sort of like address all social ills. And I think we need to be talking more about what it can and can't do, what it is and is not. And I'm concerned about policy proposals that are trying to put more sort of, reduce credentialing requirements, essentially, to get more mental health professionals out there. That concerns me, because I think having a highly credentialed, maybe not credentialed, but highly skilled provider is an important aspect of good quality care. And I worry about sort of what the training is, what sort of the cultural ideology is behind how these people are being trained, and then just, again, sort of dousing those services onto kids. If I can give an example, I read in the New York Times like a year ago, there's this big climate anxiety. This is, I think, a useful example. Climate anxiety is not something that's a formal diagnosis, but people are saying that they have climate anxiety, and mental health professionals, people within the mental health field, are saying this, which I think lends false credibility to the therapeutic approach, because you, as an authority figure, or someone that someone might be perceiving as an authority figure, is saying climate anxiety is a thing. It is a thing to be concerned about. And in this piece, I'm not sure if that one that was just pulled up was it. This therapist was talking about someone who, had come in, and the air quality was really poor that day, and the person did not bring up the air quality, and the therapist couldn't even help themselves. They were like, I wanted to tell them, why are you not concerned about this air quality right now? I think that sends a really bad message to someone. It's telling them that you should be concerned about something that of course it's worth concern, but if that's not someone's problem that they are coming to you as a therapist about, I'm not sure why that would be brought up. That just doesn't seem relevant to addressing whatever problems an individual has come in to talk about. And also, I just think that the problem with therapy, I think I have more broadly, is it's very individual and it's not very action oriented. I like things like CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, because they seem more action oriented, like how can you change your behavior? But if we're just telling everyone all the time, we're sending all these messages about thinking about how you feel, talk about how you feel, that's very different than what are you going to do about it? So I think this sort of therapeutic culture, which is different than highly skilled psychotherapy, I think that's one way that this sort of therapeutic culture that's being pushed, that's being disseminated through all this public health awareness efforts, that's one way that this is negative, I think.
Yeah, it's such a complicated problem in one sense, because speaking openly and honestly about it, people think that you're a conspiracy theorist. So if you tell them that the engines of knowledge production have been compromised, that's why I was laughing in the beginning when you said lunatics, have been compromised by lunatics who have a very specific agenda that they want to forward, an agenda of grievances, an agenda of discrimination, even if there was no actual discrimination. The idea that the discrimination should be perceived, that's to quote a turn of phrase, that it's, quote, the ordinary and everyday state of affairs. And then we're training a generation of therapists into non-evidence-based ideological practices, and those are being reified in journals not only in the credentialing mechanism, but in the peer review process. If you say that to someone, they'll think you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, the rot is so deep at this point that I don't know. I don't see that there's an easy fix, even if we knew. I mean, because there are ways to make a judgment about the efficacy of therapy. It's not particularly complicated. Yeah, you do baseline, pre and post tests, things of that nature. So, yeah, I don't know. I don't really know how we can dig ourselves out of this. So you gave one prescription, but let's say Trump were to call you up, or somebody on his team were to call you up and say, listen, we're going to give you 5 minutes with the president-elect Donald Trump, to tell him anything, any solution you think. What are the best solutions, with one proviso? They have to be cost effective. So you can't just say, like, you can't go to crazy town, to pun intended. Probably a bad pun. But Reed is laughing at my joke, my very inappropriate joke. So
yeah.
So you have 5 minutes with Trump. What do you suggest that he do? Like, what specific policy prescription should he enact?
Yeah. So let me talk about the IMD exclusion. This is a provision within Medicaid. When Medicaid was created in 1965, states had been paying for mental asylums because they had created mental asylums. Federal government did not want to take on that cost. So when Medicaid was created, it's a joint federal state program. They told states, okay, states, we will split the cost of Medicaid services with you. We'll pay at least 50%. But if a patient is treated at a psychiatric hospital, you states are going to pay for 100% of that. We don't want to pay for that. What that did was create a massive financial disincentive for states to maintain these beds in psychiatric hospitals, because states could just open the back doors, hope that those patients were served on an outpatient basis, or in the community, a euphemism that means I don't know what, but we're all about community-based services without defining what those are. And then they didn't get served. And so now we pay for this population through all of these other systems. They've spilled over into the homeless system, the criminal justice system. We pay for repeat hospitalizations in general hospitals, in ERs. So we should repeal the IMD exclusion, because states, it's been a huge financial disincentive for states to pay for this specific treatment setting, where a lot of seriously mentally ill individuals could benefit from treatment. To be clear, good mental health treatment, it's going to be expensive. We should just, I think, be willing to pay for it. And one way we can help justify the cost is by getting rid of all of this sort of bullshit programming, excuse my language, but all of these like awareness programmings that have no evidence at all for support. Mental health first aid, mental health awareness training. Again, we're trying to train people to recognize the signs and symptoms of mental disorders. There has been I've read the entire literature on these programs. Not one paper, nowhere has it shown that it helps people who needed services get services that they wouldn't have otherwise. People can recognize mental illnesses, specific mental illnesses, and specific symptoms at very, very high rates before these trainings. We should get rid of all of that. Any universal programming, mental health program, I do not think is a good thing to have. So repeal the IMD exclusion. Abolish SAMHSA, honestly. Most of what the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration is doing is a lot of this public health awareness efforts. What does promoting mental health mean? This is one of SAMHSA's goals. And I would like to know how we are defining mental health. What do we want to do when we say we are going to improve people's mental health? Because we've been doing that for the last half century. And it doesn't seem like people are feeling a lot better about themselves or their environments than they did 50 years ago. So I think we need to really sort of reconsider and at least define our goals when it comes to improving mental health and wellness. So those would be some of the things that I would do.
Okay, so I have one more question, but drill down just for a second on SAMHSA. Is there an organization that promotes that?
SAMHSA is the federal, it's within HHS. It's the federal agency that should be responsible for mental illness. There is not one agency that is on any level of government that is responsible for mental illness. SAMHSA has as one of its goals to reduce prevalence rates of mental illnesses and to promote mental health. I don't think we should be promoting mental health as a policy goal. I don't think we should do that because I don't know what that means. And I'm not sure anyone knows what that means, and it's not defined anywhere. So a lot of what they are doing is sort of this wishy-washy, vaguely defined, ambiguous, promote mental health. And because it's so ambiguous, by the way, it becomes a vehicle through which we can get a lot of these ideological pet projects through. And that also, I think, is certainly not a good thing.
Okay, so 3 things. 1, mushy season. Thank you very much. Coffee for Reed, Peter for Secretary of Education. Thank you very much, mushy. 2, sorry, I have something in my throat. I'd like to invite someone from SAMHSA on to have a conversation with me on the show, but they'll never come on. They would literally saw off their arm before they come on. But the invitation is open, so you can send one of my team an email, and as long as it has the .gov or .org, we'll have you on the show. They'll never come on. And the third thing is, let's talk about. I'm sorry. Go ahead. You wanted to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, if you're Education Secretary, please think about what we are doing from a school perspective. I think at the very least, we should be limiting what mental health programs are going on in the early years of schools. And let me just be clear, school counselors, I think they're important, they're beneficial, we should have them, but what the role of a school counselor should be more academic oriented. Mental health services should be left to the mental health system. I think the education system has enough problems of its own that it has to worry about. And again, youth mental health treatment is youth mental health programming, like these universal superficial programming, like mental health awareness, social emotional learning. This stuff is a poor trade for other programming that could be done, other resources that could be put towards education. Honestly, I'd rather see like gym class, more school, like let's give schools resources to, promote more sports. Even if it's like unorganized activity. You've got all these kids sitting in class right now. Okay, you've got 2 groups of people in schools right now. I think you've got kids that are so far behind that they're super anxious because they're so far behind their classmates. And then you've got another group of kids that are just like super bored. Neither of those groups are going to be like sitting in class behaving well. I think that's like...
Yeah. Okay. So let's go back to the phone call. You're on the call with Trump and his advisors, and they say to you, okay, this is great, but now we have a specific question. We have some guy with serious mental health issues. He's been arrested in the New York City, I don't know, whatever district, for pushing an old lady onto the subway car and almost killing her. Tell us what you think, in a sane, rational, evidence-based system, what should happen to that guy? Because he's clearly not in his right mind. It wasn't necessarily a malicious thing. He's just severely mentally ill. So can you walk us through what ought to happen to an individual like this?
Yeah, ideally an individual like that gets treatment before tragedy, not after tragedy. So if you have someone who clearly needs more intensive services and supports, we have to consider inpatient treatment. And if not, we have to consider incredibly intensive outpatient treatments. New York has Kendra's law, its law for assisted outpatient treatment. This has really great rates of reducing homelessness, incarceration, rearrests. And those are intensive wraparound services. So that would be one solution aside from inpatient treatment that could help that individual. But we should be careful about making sure that the bar of accountability for those types of programs are high. So California just passed Proposition 36. It will basically it's a tougher on crime measure that is meant to make some offenses that were only able to be classified as misdemeanors now classified as felonies. So if you have had 2 drug possession charges, for example, now that can be charged as a felony. But the type of felony that will now get charged is called a treatment mandated felony. So by default, you have to be offered treatment before incarceration, and then you have to deny that treatment. You have to say, no, I don't want that. I'd rather go to jail. This seems like a good idea in theory, but it's universal. It should be at judge's discretion, I think, to make this call. And if we are going to give everyone treatment, let's make sure that those treatment programs have a very high bar of accountability. If it's just like showing up to court once a month, that doesn't require anyone to get sober, for example, if they had a drug addiction. That high bar of accountability is, I think, something we should think about.
Okay, so let's go back to this. So you're on the phone with Trump and his advisors, and you say, we need to get this guy treatment beforehand. So just so that I'm clear, and again, this is a rather quotidian problem in New York City. Reed and I haven't seen it at all here when we travel, literally. And anyway, I don't think we've seen it once, but
it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating. So
just by the way,
what
the
is
US
the best?
fewer beds. The US has fewer psychiatric hospital beds than most every other OECD country.
Okay, well, that's interesting. So let's say this man, and I'm thinking of someone of a story I read about this. Let's say he does, or in the future, Trump says, okay, we're going to give people early treatment. We're going to try to catch it early. Is that a prophylactic against madness? What percentage of people who receive this early treatment can we expect? And I realize this is somewhat counterfactual, but can we expect to not push people into train tracks? Or is that just an impossible question to answer?
Yeah, so
seems like a necessary one.
Look, totally. Look, this is a really complicated problem, right? And I should be more clear, it's not just about early treatment. And just to go back to a public health model that I think is a problem, there's only so much early intervention that we can do because we don't know what causes mental illness. When we say early prevention, early intervention, I think that we should be talking more about individuals who have very clear signs of psychosis. So first, psychosis programs, I think, are well worth funding. We should not be proactively going into schools until for most people, most mental illnesses do not develop until late teens, early 20s. So that's part one. We should not be sort of pushing this go seek treatment message, dumping that on everyone, dousing that on everyone from very young ages. That would be one change. When we have someone who has very obvious signs of psychosis, maybe they've been arrested already, let's help that person get the right types of services. The right types of services may be inpatient treatment. It may be intensive outpatient treatment. There's only so much that the federal government can do because we are going to be restricted by what every community has on their own community level. That's why I think repealing the IMD exclusion of Medicaid is the single most important thing that the federal government can do, because you at least want to make sure that you are not disincentivizing states from investing in this important aspect of care, a setting of which these Medicaid beneficiaries, Medicaid is an important insurance provider for the seriously mentally ill individuals. And we want to make sure that there are enough beds for this population who are by definition, in most need of them. So I would say to the Trump administration, the single most important you could do is repeal the IMD exclusion.
Okay, so has anybody, and this is, I don't know how one could calculate this, again, it's outside my area of expertise, but has anyone how much this would cost in aggregate to have the kind of
Yes.
services and do the kind of preemptive care? I mean, I would imagine that number would be absolutely freaking staggering, but what are those numbers?
So CBO has scored this. I think that they've scored it around $30 billion. I think that this is deceivingly high. I do not think that this is in reality the cost.
Wow.
And CBO itself said that much of that cost would already be implemented through waiver programs that are available right now over the next few years. I think it's something like 1% of all Medicaid growth would come from this, something very small like that. I don't have the numbers offhand. That's actually I'm working on that report right now, a report that would hopefully try to help answer that question.
Okay,
Of how
so
much
Trump's people say, okay, let's say that we decide that we're going to be all in for 30 billion. What is the outcome? What does that look like?
You would hopefully have more individuals be able to get long enough treatment that they are better able to be stabilized, and because they are better stabilized, and by the way, they'd be served ideally through, again, the mental health system, through a hospital setting, as opposed to a jail, a prison, on the streets, taking up space in an ER. Patients are being boarded in emergency rooms because there's no beds available for ERs to send these patients to. So ideally, what would happen is you'd have more patients in a more appropriate setting because more of that appropriate setting is available to them. Are we going to prevent every person with mental illness from being incarcerated? No, because there's just some overlap between mental illness and criminality. We sort of think of these things as one or the other.
Yeah, you anticipated my question. So what percentage of these people simply cannot be helped?
I think that is, what do you mean by cannot be helped?
Well, no matter how many dollars we pour into their treatment, they're still going to push people into the subway tracks.
I think, they can't push someone in front of a subway track if they're hospitalized. They also can't push someone in front of the subway track if they're incarcerated. The question is, what's the most humane way to treat an individual? I think that's a question that society needs to answer. I mean, is it more humane to have someone with a serious mental illness, who has a history of violence, incarcerated, or is it more humane to have that individual in a psychiatric institution that is trained to help those individuals, with multidisciplinary teams of doctors and care workers and access to other medical services? I think there's a question about what's the more humane setting for someone like that.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask you this question, not necessarily because I agree with it, because I know someone's thinking it. Why do we accept the framework or the paradigm that we should treat people humanely who suffer from mental illness? Like, what would another treatment modality or paradigm be? Perhaps execution, or perhaps, I don't know, sticking them on an island or something. Like, why do we accept that treating them humanely is how we ought to treat them?
I think because we should try as a society to treat any vulnerable population humanely. The seriously mentally ill are some of the most vulnerable in society. And unfortunately, people with psychosis, they do not receive a lot of public sympathy. If you tell someone you have cancer, you're going to get a lot of sympathy, right? If you tell someone you have schizophrenia, you just do not get the same reaction. This is a very vulnerable population. They deserve to be championed. They deserve humane care. And I think the question is, how would we, if this happened to me or my family members, how would I want them to be treated? I think that's sort of what I come back to. And the scary thing about this is we don't know what causes schizophrenia. And so it could happen to anyone, wealthy, poor, white, black. Like it is something that could affect and does affect any and every family. And so we as a society, I think, should want to help those individuals who are most vulnerable, because if that were to happen to us, hopefully we would be treated humanely ourselves. I guess that would be my response.
Yeah, I mean, as you were saying that, I was thinking like, okay, what would happen if what would I want to happen if it happened to me versus what would I want to have happen if it happened to one of my kids? And I think for myself that the answer is extremely different. For my kids, it would be to be treated humanely. What percentage of people who suffer from serious mental illness can that be directly causally attributed to horrific parenting, beatings and negligence and malneglect, et cetera?
Yeah, so this is something separate. I think I would think about that more as like potentially causing trauma. But actually, let me. Can you clarify your question? Like,
Yeah, well,
are you asking whether those things lead to?
Oh, you cut out.
Is that what you're
Say that
asking?
again?
Do those things lead to psychosis? Are you asking, do those things lead to
causally?
psychosis?
Yeah, causally, do they lead to psychosis? And is it possible that, I would imagine it's certainly possible. So it's just, once we admit that it's possible, then the question is what percentage is it, or to what degree does trauma causally influence psychosis or severe mental health conditions? And I'm just thinking about this in terms of the family dynamic and abuse in the household.
Yeah, I think so I don't know offhand, but I would like to think about them separately, because again, because we do not know what causes this, we don't have enough evidence that those types of things are causing psychosis. What we do know, some of it is genetics, some of it is exposure to toxins, especially when women are pregnant, their children can develop psychoses. That's essentially as much as we know. Very, very severe traumas, yes, that's got to be a factor, but I worry about grouping those things together, because the same way that we call everything a mental health problem now, we call everything trauma now. And even the most serious trauma that happens, death, abuse, physical violence, sexual violence, the worst traumas, few of those individuals will go on to develop a serious mental illness. Very few. Most people are resilient. The vast majority of people are resilient to even the worst types of traumas. George Bonanno at Columbia does some great research on this. Most of the trauma research literature is sort of based on that sliver of people who do have prolonged functional impairment from their experience. So that sliver makes up a very small percentage of the overall population, but we focus on that sliver. And so we assume that all of these types of events cause trauma. I think a better way to say it, a potentially traumatic event. That's what George Bonanno says, a potentially traumatic event, as opposed to calling everything a traumatic event. So one study that I just know offhand, when 9/11 hit, right after 9/11, about 7 or 7.5% of people who were there experienced symptoms of what would be considered symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. Within 6 months, that percentage had dropped to 0.5% of people. Most people, even when faced with the most serious traumas, do go on to live meaningful, healthy lives. And so I think it's important to sort of separate trauma from psychoses, because we do not know well enough that trauma causes psychoses. I don't know the literature extensively, but that much I can confidently say.
What got you into studying this? This is quite something to have in your consciousness on a regular basis. Why did you? What's your interest in this?
Yeah, it was totally accidental. I was a psychology major undergrad, but more because I was an athlete in high school, and I sports were a very valuable way that I sort of found meaning and identity. And I felt like even at the time, are we giving too many kids ADHD medication and not just helping them, build skills through things like sports, and build leadership skills through things like sports? How can we sort of take I was interested in human behavior, right? And so that was sort of like how I came
Yeah.
into this. My first job
What was
in
your
college
sport?
was actually working in the US. I downhill ski raced primarily. Everything else was what we call dry land training. So I played soccer in the fall. I ran track in the spring, but it was just something that I'm very, very grateful our parents made us do.
Just a little detour. When you do downhill skiing, is the what's the percentage of it? Is there a high percentage of injury in that?
Oh, I have no idea. I did have one or two concussions, but I have no idea. But it's one of the. Well, you're into judo, right? You're very into judo.
Judo, Reed, judo. No, jujitsu. But Reed is just beginning his
Jiu-jitsu,
jujitsu
okay.
journey. No, I'm really into jujitsu.
Okay.
I do takedowns once in a while too, which
Okay,
is kind of
so
like judo. It's clinch. Yeah.
okay. This is something I think my brother's just gotten into Muay Thai, so I'm trying to better understand like all this thing. So
That's an
skiing,
insane
I'm
activity.
very fortunate to have done because I think it's insane too. I mean, the head injuries I would worry about for him.
Tell him to immediately
Maybe was that
cease it. He's gonna be the likelihood of being seriously injured in that, knees to the head, elbows to the head. It's a truly insane activity.
I will tell him, but he's not going to want to hear it. He loves it. He's just gotten super into it, and I am happy for him because this is something he's finding a lot of meaning in his life doing. And skiing, in the same way, I think is a sport that is more like a hobby. You can do it throughout your life. And my parents, to their credit, just worked so hard. My dad taught he coached our ski team so that we could get free, basically ski passes, so that my family could afford to do it. And, because it's an expensive sport, but it's something that we can now do anywhere in the world. And it keeps my siblings and I active. We do it together. So we all live I'm one of four. We all live across the country now. My brother's in Seattle. My sister's actually in London. My other brother is in DC. I'm in Dallas. We travel together to ski. It's like a good excuse to get out in the winter when you might feel cooped up otherwise. And yeah, anyway, I could go on about how it's, I think.
Just quick question. A quick question. Did you ever do any other team activity or group activity or sport other than skiing?
Yeah, so I played soccer in the fall and I ran track in the spring. And my dad had this thing, the 3 A's, the 3 R's: reading, writing, arithmetic. His thing was academics, athletics, and the arts. So we all had to play a sport every season and we had to do something artistic. So I played the bass guitar in high school. And so that was, I thought, a nice way to...
Sorry, there's a terrible lag on my end. So just real quick, I just want to plumb this just a little bit. I have an answer that I have in my head that I won't say. I can whisper it to Reed. But was one of those activities that you did, was the camaraderie more intense than the others?
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's probably soccer. I think team sports are a great way to learn how to work with other people, help develop leadership, help develop your role. What is my role on this team as opposed to Sarah's role or, someone else's role.
Do you bring any?
Cool,
Yeah. Do you bring any of the lessons, and then we'll wrap it up pretty soon, but do you bring any of the lessons that you took from competitive sports to what you're doing now, to studying these contentious issues?
Maybe just anything that So I came to this work really accidentally, but sports always made me want to be in, my dad used to call it in the hunt, be in the game, be, at the top of what I was doing. And so as an adult, my career has progressed, I've always wanted to know the things that I know other people know that I didn't know. So I started out my career on Capitol Hill, just sort of by chance. I was never into politics or anything, but that it's sort of there where I figured I was very interested in what makes a good idea. And I didn't know that. So I didn't know what, kind of made a good idea. So I went to work at Manhattan Institute because I thought what they were doing was very practical minded. Manhattan Institute has history for working with policymakers, elected officials across the aisle to implement programs. So they worked with Cory Booker when he was mayor of Newark to implement a prisoner reentry program. They helped develop some of the first charter schools in the states. That sort of always appealed to me. When I got there, I sort of helped build our portfolio on mental health policy, and our president was asking me, how would it be better to do this thing or that thing? And I realized that it wasn't that I didn't have a quantitative background, but I didn't think we actually had the public data available to answer these questions. So I became sort of obsessed with new types of data for policy research. So I went to go work at a think tank within JP Morgan Chase. They're doing super interesting work studying the economy using Chase proprietary data. As soon as I got there, I realized that I didn't want to be the one not working with the data. So I went to grad school and I learned how to computer program and then worked on their research team, programming essentially for a year and a half. But while I was working on that issue, I just felt like people with a Chase mortgage and a Chase checking account where we can see, student loans being withdrawn from that checking account, that individual is just fundamentally so much better off than the homeless schizophrenic who I had been thinking about at Manhattan Institute. I just couldn't give up this issue and thought it brought a lot of value to my life, I think, working on this issue and feeling like, and I think because I'm very interested in this population and not some specific ideology, I think it helps me keep an open mind about what actually is a good idea. And we have to be willing to admit that maybe something we thought was a good idea isn't a good idea. And if you really want to put into place the policies that will most help some person, I think it's important to recognize that those ideas could come from any ideology and they're at least worth listening to.
Cool. Well, Carolyn, I very much appreciate you taking your time to talk to me today, and I appreciate the work that you're doing. Where can people find you?
Yeah, so my work is online at Manhattan Institute's website. I'm on X, though I'll admit I am like very bad. I'll go on sort of binges where I'm tweeting a lot and then months where I do not. But I'm trying to be more consistent about it, but it butts up against my attempts to not use social media as much as well.
I understand. Well, we appreciate the time you've taken. Keep your computer on. Thanks everybody in the comments. Thanks to Mushy again. And as always, thanks to Reed for helping out. And maybe if I go, I won't say the name of the city you are. Maybe we'll all go out, be fun. We'll have a drink and some dinner. So I appreciate your time and appreciate the work you're doing. So thanks a lot, Carolyn. And again, keep your tab open. We'll see everybody. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. This falls under the umbrella of my nonprofit, National Progress Alliance. Your generous donations keep us going and help fuel content like this. We truly appreciate your support. Thanks again, and we'll see you in the next one.